Hey everyone, and welcome to our February live event with Nicki LaFoille. She's once again here to answer all of your sewing questions. Thanks so much for being here, Nicki.
Hey everybody.
All right, so we're going to get started right away with our first question from Anne. And she says, what is the best thing to use when sewing knit fabric to cotton so it doesn't ripple?
When sewing a woven fabric, I'm assuming like a woven cotton, to a knit fabric, you don't have to do much different. I would recommend, if you can, trying to have the knit layer on the bottom so that the feed dogs are touching it on the bed of your sewing machine, so that will help pull it along. If it was on the top, sometimes that's a good way for the presser foot to squish it down, and then you'll get the knit stretching against the cotton, and you'll get uneven edges at the end. You could, if you're experiencing some of that, you could put a walking presser foot on to try and feed those layers evenly. You could put a layer of tissue paper between the layers. That solves a lot of issues if you're having slippage or one fabric stretching. That could also help, but you can just, use your universal needle, and yeah, there's not a ton that needs to, you don't have to do much real special unless you're having some specific problems.
Do you use a lot of pins when you're sewing with knit, or do you not use a lot of pins?
I do. I use a lot of pins in general, but when sewing knits, I do use a lot of pins. That helps to stabilize and keep the layers together. And you can even use pins instead of going perpendicular to the edge. You can go parallel, and that kind of holds, more of the fabric with each pin along the seam line.
Perfect. Sometimes it's even easier to take them out if you go that way. Like you can take them out as you go. Yeah, perfect. All right, next question here is from Carol. And she says she's attaching a casing for elastic to a 6-gore skirt. And she says, what stitch do I use to attach it? I'm using a medium weight fabric with a little stretch, so the stitch has to stretch.
So if the stitch, anytime a seam has to stretch, you want to use a stretch stitch. So that could be a zigzag stitch, or it could be a triple stitch, which on your sewing machine looks just like 3 lines together, and that will stitch 1 forward, 1 back, or 2 forward and 1 back, and that allows a little bit of give and stretch in the seam.
Perfect. All right, I just want to remind anyone out there, if you're just tuning in, if you have any questions for Nicki, go ahead and put those in the comment box below the video, and we're going to work our way through answering as many questions as we possibly can for the next hour. So we're going to move on here, and the next question is there a formula for choosing the right machine needle to use? I've always just used the same for everything that I sew.
There are some instances where you will want to use a specialty needle. If you've never had any problems, if you've never had skip stitches or thread nests bunching up or thread breakage, a universal needle is good for 90% of your projects. It's great for, a bunch of different weights of cotton. You can use it for thinner fabrics as well. If you are sewing something thicker, say faux leather or genuine leather, they do make a specific leather needle, which can be helpful in piercing through those thick layers. It has a really nice sharp chisel tip. If you're sewing something that's very thin and lightweight, drapey like chiffon or something, and if you're getting snags, you can try a microtex needle. That's just a very thin needle with a very thin sharp point that will just make very fine holes in that fine fabric to, eliminate any damage from the needle to that fabric. When you're sewing with knits, this is the big one. When you're sewing with knits, you'll want to use a ballpoint needle or a jersey needle or a stretch needle. I kind of use them interchangeably. If you're using something with a ton of stretch like lycra or spandex, a stretch needle is probably your best bet. It is made specifically for those stretchy fabrics. And that just has a slightly rounded tip to kind of nestle in between those interlocking fabrics, interlocking threads on the knit, instead of piercing them and like cutting those fibers as something with a sharp tip like a universal needle might do. So that just helps preserve the fabric and the stretch of the fabric. So you'll want to use that. If you are doing top stitching, a top stitching needle can be helpful, and these needles are labeled really nicely. So top stitching needle, it has a bigger eye. So when you're using top stitching thread that is a little bit heavier weight and a little bit thicker, that will go through the eye of that top stitching needle easier. So you will get fewer stitching problems and fewer thread breakage issues. And if you're sewing thick denim layers, they make a needle called a jeans needle. That is helpful for that. Those are the main types. So if you're doing something specialty, you can look that up. But in general, like I mentioned, 90% of the time a universal needle will be everything that you need.
I can definitely admit that I'm pretty sure I sewed with not only like the same needle for everything, but like the same needle for like the first year. I don't know if I ever even changed it. But I like how you mentioned that they're definitely labeled very user friendly. Like you said, jeans needle is jeans, leather is leather. So very handy.
Yeah, when you're at the fabric store, just take a look at those needles, and if you see something that looks like it may be useful for the project that you're doing, say you're going to the fabric store to get faux leather to make a faux leather purse, you see a leather needle, you may want to give it a shot, give it a try, see if that helps make your sewing easier, because that's what they are designed to do.
Absolutely. All right, this next question kind of goes right along with what you're just talking about, but they say, I know you need a ballpoint needle for knits, but can you also use a ballpoint needle on cotton?
You can, especially if it is a more open weave cotton. Like I mentioned, the ballpoint needle just has kind of a rounded tip at the end. So if you're using many layers of a tightly woven cotton, I think you would probably get some stitching issues and tension issues. That needle would probably have trouble going through all those layers of densely woven fabric, since it doesn't have a sharp tip to pierce through it. So in some instances, I would say you can, but a universal needle is your best bet for woven cotton fabrics.
Absolutely. And I mean, in general, do you have any tips for if you're having stitch issues, is the needle the first thing you should check as far as like changing that up?
Yes, so if you're having stitch problems, the first thing you would want to do is rethread your machine. So if you're having tension problems, thread breakage, thread nests, take all the thread out and just redo it, making sure that thread hits every point, every tension point that's needed when you're threading your machine. Even break out your manual maybe to make sure, look at the diagram and make sure you've got everything right. Make sure that thread is going through those tension discs. So after you have rethreaded your machine, if you're still having issues, I would take a look at your needle, see if it's dull. You may need to change it. If the fabric, when you're sewing, if the fabric is doing this bouncing, or if you're hearing a bump, 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 like a thwop, thwop, as your needle is trying to go through that fabric, that's a good indication that your needle is dull and you need to change it. So yeah, change your needle. Take a look at the type of needle you're using. So you may need to use a different kind of needle to get the right thread tension and the right stitch formation that you're looking for. Take a look at the needle in conjunction with your thread. So like I mentioned, if you're using a top stitching thread or a heavyweight thread, you're going to need a needle that has a larger eye. Otherwise, that thick thread going through a tiny eye puts a lot of tension on the thread. It can throw off your tension and your stitch formation. It can also lead to thread breakage. Make sure your machine is clean. This is like whenever you're having any problem with anything, this is like my checklist that I go through. If you're having any sort of stitch issues, thread nests, everything, this is tension issues, this is a good start to finish list of things to check. So make sure your machine is clean. Take the throat plate up and take everything out of the bobbin area and brush it out with your little brush that comes with the sewing machine. You can floss out in between the tension discs with a piece of cotton fabric, see if there's anything caught in there, especially if you've been sewing something like fleece or terry cloth or something. It has a lot of fuzz and velvet, something with a pile. That all that lint and threads can get gummed up and caught in all those little areas of your sewing machine. So make sure everything is clean. That's a good place to start. And if you're still having tension issues, ask me specifically what issue you're having and I will tell you what to do.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, because I just thought of it, when you're changing out your needles, because I used to always just use a universal needle and then just put it in my pincushion, and there I just knew all of my needles on my pincushion were all universal needles. But since now I'm, doing what I'm supposed to be doing and using different needles, I have my pincushion sort of like cordoned off, so I know that in like this section would be a leather needle and this section is universal. So that way, if you don't keep all those little plastic cases they come in, that way you know which needles, so you can actually go back and use them again. But
and if you have it like a tomato pin cushion, you can use a fine tip marker and even like write on it what is in that little slice of the tomato.
Yeah, that's perfect. See, now everyone out there has no excuse not to be using the correct needles.
That's right.
All right, our next question here is from Karen, and she says, I'm just starting to get back to sewing. Should I worry about using my old thread?
Typically, no. If your thread has been stored correctly, so in a dry place away from heat sources and away from direct sunlight, you should be fine to use vintage thread, the kind that comes on the wooden spools even, that great, beautiful old vintage thread. Where you run into problems where that old thread may break a lot or fray a lot is if it was stored in somewhere where it's humid, like a basement in the Midwest, or in direct sunlight, which UV light will break down the fibers of that thread and make it not ideal to use in your projects. And so you should be fine. I know, Ashley, you've mentioned a product before that can help fortify old thread as well.
Yeah, it's called Sewer's Aid, and it's just a thread conditioner, and it comes in like a little bottle, and you just take your spool of thread and you just like run one line of it down the side, and then as it unspools while you're using it, it sort of distributes itself through there. So if you're at all worried, you could just put some of that on there before you even got started. You should be fine. All right, our next question here is from Peggy, and she wants to know if you have any suggestions for websites that sell sewing needles and other notions. She says her Joanne Fabrics is very small and they don't carry the special types that you have been describing.
Everything that I buy online basically comes from Amazon.com. It's the largest online marketplace. They have everything. They sell food. They sell everything. So whenever I'm looking for something, I always go to Amazon.com and type it in. And usually they have different options from different sellers, so you can get a good price. So that is always the first place that I go. As far as other places, I don't have any specific places that I go back to for notions other than Amazon.
I think the only one, and I don't necessarily always search this one out first, but if I'm ever, say, Google searching for a sewing notion, Nancy's Notions is like the first one that always comes up because she literally has everything. But then, I mean, it always is good to check, like you said, Amazon for prices and things like that. And, like shipping to certain areas might be different, but In general, you could just Google too and see which ones come up, but Nancy's notions will definitely come up.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, our next question here is from Rhonda, and she says, what is the better needle when sewing a fleece fabric?
For fleece, you know, actually for fleece, you could probably use a ballpoint needle, because fleece is, the pile, I believe, is the way that it is made is on a knit backing. So fleece is generally pretty stretchy. So you could use a ballpoint needle. I've never had a problem using a universal needle on fleece. So I don't think there's a huge difference there. But my main tip when talking about needles with fleece is change them often, because fleece will dull your needle pretty quickly. So if you're doing like a big fleece blanket, you may even want to change your needle in the middle of the project. I know they say for every 6 hours of sewing, you want to change your needle. But for things like fleece and felt and leather, things with metallic flecks in them, those things will dull your needle quicker. So you may want to just keep that in mind and change that needle a little more frequently.
So since it's going to dull a universal or regular needle anyway to almost the shape of a ballpoint needle, would it be similar, or is that sort of a weird connection to make?
It might. That's a good point. That's yeah, that makes logical sense to me. So
I don't know if it'll work or not, but yeah, I figure if it's going to dull my needle anyway, I'm going to start with one that's already kind of dull. So might as well.
might as well.
All right. Our next question here is from Misty, and she says, I'm sewing with a thin satin fabric and my thread is bunching. Any tips on preventing that?
Yeah, so when sewing with a very thin fabric, a lot of times it'll bunch up at the beginning of the seam, but even if it's bunching up like in the middle of the seam, you can start, so if it's bunching up at the beginning of the seam, you would want to start a couple of stitches in away from the cut edge, because the needle is just pushing the fabric down into the throat plate, and it's not moving it under the foot, and it's just getting all bunched up and all gross under there. I hate it when that happens. So you can, there's a single stitch throat plate that you can get that combats that, but you can only use a straight stitch with it. And instead of getting something special, I always just, you can start like a ½ inch or something in away from the cut edge, and then back stitch a couple of stitches to get that last little bit, and then continue on with your seam. If that doesn't help, you can start on a starter square of any type of scrap fabric to get the seam started, and just butt that thin satin fabric up to the edge of that and keep going. And back stitch at the beginning of your project fabric, and then cut that starter square away. You can also put something under the start of the seam, or if it's bunching up along the whole seam, you can put something under the entire seam, something like tearaway stabilizer or tissue paper, which is great to stabilize thin fabric. Ashley's laughing at me because I say that all the time, but it's true. You should try it. So yeah, and using a thin satin fabric, you may want to use a microtex needle or just a thinner universal needle. That can help keep your seam nice and pretty. And even a thin silk thread can help when stitching thin fabric. That helps keep your seam nice and flat along the whole way down. So yeah.
I mean, I laugh, but I do believe you, and I have used it before. When I picture your sewing room, I picture like fabric here and tissue paper here. So it's just like, that's what I giggle about when you mention it.
Stacks of tissue paper everywhere.
Yes. Different colors too, matches the fabric. All right. I know we touched on this just a little bit ago, but Mar wants to know, what's your favorite way to keep track of a good needle when you switch it out to sew on another kind of fabric?
I don't have a good pin cushion like Ashley does, so that I can keep track of them in the little tomato slices. So if I'm changing a needle and if I want to keep that needle, I just take a scrap of cotton fabric and I'll just like hook it in and write next to it what it is, the size it is, and if I'm feeling, you know, like I'm on top of it, I may even write down how many hours of sewing I did with that needle, or, you know, what I sewed with that needle on, so I know how much it will be good for when I put it back on. So I just use a scrap of cotton fabric, nothing too high tech.
And I just thought of it, and I'm gonna have to search it and figure out what it's called, but it looks like, it literally looks like a mouse pad, and it's printed on there already, and it has all the little sections, and it has, you know, universal, or even has the weights, and you literally can stick them in there, and it has everything already printed right on there. And I know there's a brand name
I feel
of
like
it.
it's probably Schmetz.
Okay, you're probably right. Yeah, but it literally looks like a mouse pad, and it has everything printed on there already.
Yeah, that's
So,
kind of handy.
yeah, perfect. All right, our next question here is from Bonnie. She says she has a playground parachute that needs repaired that's nylon. What is the best way to hold it together while I'm sewing, and what kind of needle should I use?
For nylon, you can just pin that when you're trying to hold it together for sewing. Make sure you're using thin pins, nothing that's going to snag, because nylon can snag pretty easily. Use a thin universal needle for that, or a microtex needle, because in nylon you can create snags, like I mentioned, easily. And if you're using a larger size needle, it may create, as it's piercing that nylon, it may create holes that are too big, and then the seam is going to grin through. And so a thinner needle would be best for that, or even a microtex if it is convenient for you.
Absolutely. And if you want more information on sewing with nylon, because we're like 20 minutes into this and I haven't plugged a class yet, but we have an entire class on sewing with nylon and all the ins and outs of everything you need to know for the different types of nylon, how to sew it, prepare it, everything you need to know. So we do have that class. All right. Our next question here, I'm not sure how much you know about vintage machines, but Victoria says that she has her grandmother's treadle sewing machine that she learned to sew on. It's in a cabinet and it's very heavy. I cannot see an easy way to remove it from the cabinet, but besides a new belt, is there anything like oiling that I should do before I use it?
You're right. I don't know much about vintage machines, and it seems like for every brand, you know, things are different. For vintage machines, it may not be so much brand specific as it is now. But yeah, I am not sure. I would have to Google that to see. But you can always type into your search bar the brand and the model if it has like a model number on it. Just type that in and type, you know, oiling or care after the brand and the model. And people put a lot of stuff online. You may even be able to find like a manual for it if you don't have the manual with the vintage machine. So you'd be surprised at the very specific things you can find on the internet if you type it into the search bar.
Absolutely. And I'm sure there's got to be like service companies out there that's a part of maybe something that they do, that even if you wanted to have someone come look at it and make sure it's fully operational, that's something that they could do also. Yeah. So, all right, our next question here, they want to know, how do you transfer a pattern from online to make it a usable pattern? Like, how do you print off a pattern?
Yes, printing patterns from the internet is a common question. It can be kind of confusing because there are a lot of different types. Like if you get a really good online pattern from a company who does it a lot, like Sew News, they tile their patterns for you. They put cross marks in the corners so that you know where to line them up. But you know, a blogger who just, you know, hand drew something and put it up on their blog, and you type in shift dress and that comes up, they may not have done all those really nice things for you. So you want to make sure that when you're printing it off, it prints off full size. So when you press Control P or print, and it comes up in the print preview, and it just looks like one piece of paper, and the whole dress is on one piece of paper, that is not going to work. That is shrinking that. A lot of times the computer will automatically just say, we're going to print this whole thing onto one page. It's going to shrink it down to one page. So you want to make sure that you check the box that says tile all pages in Adobe. That's in Adobe Acrobat. Yes, Acrobat. And that is the easiest way to do it, is to make sure that is in a PDF format, which is the format that Acrobat reads. So make sure you tile all pages, and that splits that big pattern up into as many pages as it needs to fit on. And when you print it out, you will line up those pages and tape them together, cut it out along the perimeter, along the, the cutting lines, and that is your pattern. So it's harder when it's not already tiled for you. It's harder to line it up and get it exact. So I know that's a frustration for a lot of people, because an 1/8 of an inch off here and an 1/8 of an inch off there, and it can really throw something off. So whenever you can, try to get your online patterns from from a professional. I think Berta Style has really good online patterns, and like mellysews.com, she has good online patterns, and I'm sure Berta Style has online patterns, but larger companies like that will tile it for you. So all you have to do when you save that file is print it, and it will have like a guide sheet that prints first, that shows you the diagram of how the sheets of paper need to be taped together, and it will have either cross marks in the corners of the pages for you to line up and tape together, or an entire line at the edge of the page for you to line up and tape together. So it eliminates a lot of room for error when you get a pattern like that that's professionally done and already tiled. So that helps a lot. And just make sure you're working on a large flat surface when you do that. Use a lot of tape if you need to, and just take your time and be careful, because like I mentioned, accuracy matters when you're taping together all those little pieces.
I think, I believe I remember back when we were at Sew News, seeing you laying a lot of things out on the floor, taping them together quite a few times.
I did that so much. I was just like in the hallway with 25 sheets of paper, taping them together. I did it a lot. Yes, I did.
Like, what's Nikki do? Oh, she's in the hallway. She'll be back. It's fine. All right, so since we're talking about patterns, someone says, can you share any tips on the process of cutting out patterns to make sure they're accurate?
Yes. So when you're cutting out patterns, like a commercial pattern, the black cutting lines that they use a lot of times are pretty thick. So you want to make sure that you're cutting on the outer edge of that line. Just like when you're cutting out the fabric, use your scissors so that the edge of your scissors are right on the edge of that line. If you are cutting out excuse me, if you're cutting out a smaller size, so in patterns that come in multi-sizes, if you want to cut out a smaller size, I would recommend maybe tracing off the larger size, like a larger size, so that, because when you cut out a smaller size, you can't really like tape it back into the graded sizes. So maybe start a size larger, or trace off onto a separate sheet of paper the larger size, so that you have it preserved, because there's nothing worse than that. And a lot of times comparing your measurements to the measurements on the back of a commercial pattern, kind of confusing sometimes, and if you cut out the wrong size, it's like, well, now the pattern is, you know, it's cut out in this a size that's too small for me. So now it's kind of, you know, wasted. So either cut out a larger size or trace it off to have that master, that just for safety.
I remember growing up, my mom was the one who taught me how to sew, and she always, if she cut out the smaller size, would even keep like the little strips, you know, that she could tape back on to make the larger size. And that's literally like the first thing that I throw away when I cut it. It's like, this is the size I'm gonna make, done. All those little tiny things, she would save all of them, put them back in the envelope. So, but tracing seems easier.
Yeah, it does.
All right, our next question here is from Leslie, and she says, do you have any special techniques for design placement on ready-mades?
So embroidery designs?
I'm gonna assume that, yeah.
Yes. So when placing embroidery designs on ready-made garments, you would want to avoid a couple of areas. And there are some areas that are more aesthetically pleasing. So if you're doing a shirt, if you're doing it in the center, just make sure it's very centered. Take your time measuring the center and laying it on the hoop. There's nothing worse than having something that's just, maybe it's just me, if something is just like a little bit off center, I can't handle it. So if it's in the center, just make sure it is in the center. Up here, if you're doing like a little logo, that's a good place, a good placement for embroidery designs. Avoid areas on the garment, obviously, that are bulky, like along seams. You can do it if it's like a thinner cotton. You can embroider over seams. But on something like jeans, if you're trying to embroider over that big, bulky, flat-felled side seam, sometimes if you're using an embroidery design that is very dense, you can run into a lot of problems with the needle piercing through that really thick, all those layers of denim. Avoid areas. So an embroidery design is going to draw the eye. So avoid areas that you do not want the eye drawn to. Those are my placement tips. That's all I got.
Well, and I'd say too, if you have like a shirt and say, I don't know, maybe you can't like print out your design to see what it is, but you like, you know what size it's going to be, just like cut out a piece of paper and like pin it to different places on the shirt and see if you even like where it's going to be, you know.
Yes.
Right out.
Good idea. And if you can, yeah, print out the image of the design if you can in the size that it's going to be, and definitely audition it and look in the mirror and see if you like it.
That way there's no surprises.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, our next question here is from Rhonda, and she says, could you explain needle sizes? What do they mean and when to use specific sizes?
Yes. So needles, most of the different types of needles come in different sizes. So I have a pack of jersey needles and a pack of universal needles, and they both run the range from 70-10 up to 90-14. So they use two numbers. One is European sizes and one is European sizes and one is US sizes or something like that for some reason. But the lower the number, the thinner the needle. So 70-10 is thinner than 90-14. And I think needles even go down to 65 or something. They go even lower than 70-10. Ashley's going to Google it for me. I can see it in your eyes. But I think 90-14 may be the thickest or the largest size. I'm not sure. But an 80-12 is kind of right in the middle. And that's like a good universal mid-range size that is going to be good for 95% of the time. But like I mentioned, if you're stitching something that is a really thin, fine fabric, you want to use a thinner needle to avoid making large holes in that nice, fine fabric. And conversely, if you are stitching something that is thicker, you may want a needle that is bigger, stronger to go through 7 layers of denim. So you might want a larger needle for that.
So I have found that the sizes range from 68 to 120, 19.
Oh, wow.
There's a big range.
That's-
I didn't even know that there was one that's fine. So I'll have to even see what that one's used for. Maybe it's new. I don't know. But all right, our next question here is from Corinne, and she says, "I'm new to sewing. Do you recommend any books for beginners?"
I don't really have any book recommendations for beginners. I went to school to learn how to sew. I learned from my grandma, and if there's anything that I don't know that I need to look up, I turn to the internet. So I don't really have any sewing reference books that I use. I have a pattern drafting reference book that I sometimes look at, but that's really it for books. I don't really have any recommendations.
Believe it or not, we have a video that is on our website. One of our instructors, DJ Humbach, talks about how to build your sewing library, and she has several books that she shows her go-tos that she says she can't live without, and then some other ones to sort of just fill out maybe your specific sewing need, whether that's garments or home decor. But so that's a good video. If you just search sewing books on our website, that'll come up, and she has a bunch of books. And so I think that's just kind of the difference in you either like your books in your library or you're like us and you like your Google. So you'll have one or the other. All right, our next question here is from Judy, and she says, "Can you explain the difference in visual center and actual center on embroidery designs?"
I can take a shot at it. I don't know specifically, but it sounds like an embroidery design, sometimes it can look like, if there's a flower, you would maybe put the center up here in the flower, but if there's like a long stem, the center of the design would be like more on the stem rather than in the, the bud where the action is happening in the design. So if a design has more going on in one area, you may want to put the center over there, but you have to look at the actual size of the entire design to find the center.
Yeah, I would call like the visual center like the focal point, or like what you're drawn to,
where your eye goes, rather than the actual center. That would be, you measure to find that.
Yeah, I think so. All right. Next question here is from Mar, and she says, "How would a person know if they have a low shank or high shank for buying sewing machine feet online?"
That is a good question. I know that I have a low shank machine simply because I believe it tells me in my manual. So you can look in your manual. You can also Google that. Google your machine make, brand and model, and type in low shank or high shank, and somebody will probably have answered that question. Or you can call a dealer, and even if you didn't buy your machine from that dealer, you can ask them the question, and I'm sure they would have no problems answering that for you.
Absolutely, because I did just try to search it, and it does come up with it. Some of them are brand specific. The one that came up just happened to be for a Singer machine, and it just tells you to put your presser foot down and measure, and then from there it will tell you. But I mean, I don't know if that's the same for Singer to Brother to all that. So definitely your manual will tell you what kind of feet you need to buy.
Yeah.
All right. Our next question here is from Pat, and she says, "What tips or guidelines do you have for creating an elastic waistband similar to those found in commercial skirts or pants, one that has the elastic surge to the fabric edge? She just wants an elasticized waist that will not roll over after time and usage."
Yeah. So you can do an exposed elastic waist, which is the easiest way to attach a waistband to the waistband of anything, a skirt or pants. Let me see if I have it. I don't have it right here, but so you can place the elastic, so measure the length of elastic you need, and sew that so the ends right sides together if your elastic has a right and a wrong side. Or you can, for an exposed waistband, that is what I would do. I would right sides together, so like a regular seam. You could also lap the ends over top of each other and stitch a rectangle or a square with an X in the middle to hold those together. And then quarter mark your elastic. So you'll have the seam at one end as one mark, and fold it in half, pin mark the half, and then open it up and fold it so that the pin is matched with the seam, and then mark the folds in the ends. So that is called quarter marking. So you've split it into quarters. Do the same thing for your skirt or your pants or whatever you're putting your waistband in. Quarter mark that, the circumference of that, and then match the waistband, the elastic to your waistband. So making sure the seam of the waistband is either in the back seam of the garment or a side seam, wherever you want to put it is fine, and match those quarter pins. Pin them together on the right side of the garment. And you can align those raw edges, align the edge of the elastic with the raw edge of the garment. And then put it under your presser foot at one of those pin markings. Take a stitch or two to lock it in, and then stretch the elastic to match the length of your garment in that section, that quarter section, and sew it. So you have to kind of keep it taut in between those pins in a quarter section, kind of guide it under the foot. Use a stretch stitch, a zigzag stitch or a triple stitch, and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You don't really need much, so keep that in mind for cutting the waistband of the waist of your garment. And that will gather the fabric into the elastic. So when you stretch the elastic to get it up over your hips, it'll stretch and then it'll cinch back in, and you've got your exposed waistband. That's the easiest way to do it. You can also do a faux casing, which encases the elastic in the fabric so it looks like a casing, but the elastic is stitched to the fabric, so there will be no rolling or anything. You can even do a traditional casing where you double fold the fabric toward the wrong side, thread the elastic through, and put stitches in the side seams or put a stitch in the back, just perpendicular along the length, the width of the elastic, to just to keep it in place in one or two places so that it won't twist. You can do fold over elastic on an edge. So there are a lot of different types of elastics that you can do for waistbands to combat twisting in a casing. And I have a video that should be up on the website on nationalsewingcircle.com in the next couple weeks or couple months or something. It's a intermediate sewing video, so it goes over a lot of topics, but there's a section on elastics where I demonstrate 4 different types of elastic waistbands, so you can check that out too.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here is from Jerry Lynn, and she says, you mentioned tracing. I always traced years ago, but I don't find today's tracing paper does a very good job. What do you use?
So there are a lot of different types of tracing paper that I didn't even know about. There's like that medical grade paper, Swedish tracing paper. I just buy craft paper, Kraft. It's just like a regular copy paper weight, but it comes on rolls. And I got like a 4-foot tall roll of like 100 yards of paper. And I just lay out a section and I place my pattern that I want to trace on my section of craft paper. And I either weight it down with pattern weights, or I'll tape it down if it's an old pattern that I'm going to throw away. Or when I was in college, we had the really thick self-healing mats, and my instructor gave me, she went around and she gave each of us like 6 of these tiny little pins. I think they're hat pins because I have Googled and looked on Amazon since I graduated like 10 years ago looking for these, and they're hat pins. So it's really weird. They're just really short pins, and we would pin the pattern into, like, through the, you know, the pattern and the paper that we're tracing it onto, and pin it into that self-healing mat. And that was my favorite way to do it. You could get the patterns really nice and flat. I don't have a self-healing mat now, so I just use pattern weights, but it still works. And I use my, I'm not going to dig around for it, but I have a tracing wheel that is like the tracing wheels you use to trace off markings, except it looks more like a torture device because the wheel has these intense sharp spines, and that's for piercing the paper. So you use that to trace around the curves, to poke little holes in the paper so that you can go in later with your French curve ruler and your pencil and draw those in. So that is how I would trace a pattern off, and make sure you get all the markings if you've got darts and length and shorten lines, bust markings, hip line markings, you know, notches, anything like circles or squares on the pattern are for matching, you know, matching your fabric together. So make sure you trace those off as well.
Absolutely. I mean, any kind of roll of paper, that way you're not like taping together sheets of paper. All right, our next question here is from Pamela, and she says, what are your tips on sewing faux furs? I have several child's line vests to make and have never sewn with this material before.
Hi, Pamela. I have not sewn with faux fur very much, but when I worked for Sew News, I came across a lot of stories and edited a lot of stories that worked with faux fur. So here are the tips that I have heard. You want to make sure that the fur is brushed away from the seam line. You can trim the fur away within the seam lines. If you've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just like shave the fur off within your seam allowance. Get rid of that bulk. And then brush the faux fur away from the seam line so that it doesn't get trapped in your stitches. And when you are cutting faux fur, kind of make sure you're doing the same thing. You know, brush that fur away from your cutting line so that you're not accidentally cutting the fur, even though you're going to cut it away from the seam allowance anyway. It's just, you're going to get fur everywhere. So kind of try and control that. Do all your markings. Obviously, you'll have to do all your markings on the wrong side. And when you cut, try to cut with the wrong side up and cut just through the backing and not through any of the faux fur, to minimize mess. That's all. Those are all the tips I have.
Yeah, that's all good tips. I do have a class on the website also. It's called Working with Difficult Fabric, and I believe faux fur is a section in that one as well. So, but I think it has a lot of the same tips that Nicki just covered. So those, I mean, they'll definitely get you going started sewing with those. So, all right, our next question here is from Linda, and she says, I'd like tips on altering ready-made patterns if you have any.
Let's see. The main tip that I have there is when you're altering a pattern, like a commercial pattern, make sure that so if you're like taking in a shirt or something, make sure that you take in even amounts throughout the circumference of the pattern, whatever pattern it is. And if you're adding to open it up, you want to do that in even amounts along the pattern. So if you're trying to put like 2 inches right in one section, it's going to kind of throw things off. So if you're trying to put in or take out more than like 3/4 to 1 inch, you'd want to split that up And, you know, the more that you are taking out or putting in, the more places you're going to want to spread that out. So if you're adding volume to a sleeve and you want to add 3 inches of volume, I would go 4 or 5 different places along the width of that sleeve to slash and spread, or slash and overlap. So just try to, you know, keep things even, and keep in mind that when you take a 1/4 inch off of a side seam, it's going to take in the garment 1 inch, because it's taking off 1/4 inch on each side of the front, and everything you do to the front, you want to do to the back in general. So it would take 1/4 inch off of each side of the back as well. So that shrinks everything in. You know, you think it's not much when you just do 1/4 inch here, but it adds up to more when you're doing it to the whole thing. Yeah, just making sure anything you do to a seam, you have to make sure that you do to the matching seam. And unless you have a specific question that I can answer, that's all the general tips that I have right now.
And I think, don't you have some pattern alteration tips in that intermediate sewing class as well?
I do. I do have a pattern alteration section. So there are some good tips in there.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here is from Peggy, and she says, what brands of elastic have you found to be long lasting? I'm so tired of elastic giving out quickly or falling apart when dry cleaned.
It's a really good question. Yikes. I don't know that I really pay attention to the brand when I'm buying elastic. I haven't had any problems. I usually go with the cheapest kind of elastic, if I'm being honest with you. And I haven't really had any problems with elastic giving out. Maybe I don't wash my clothes often enough. But yeah, I don't know. I haven't really.
Yeah, I guess I don't really focus on brands either. I know they say you're going to put elastic in swimwear. You know, there's elastic that can be used in chlorinated water, or says, you know, it can't. So there are some that maybe check the back and make sure it doesn't have specific washing instructions, or it can't stand to high heat or something like that. So I wouldn't necessarily maybe say brand, but type or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, all right. Our next question here, they say they're trying to make a summer purse or tote and want a solid bottom. They say if I use cardboard, I won't be able to wash it. So what should I do?
They make an interfacing called Peltex. I'm sure it's by Pellon. That's why it's called Peltex. That is really, really stiff. I have some over there, but I'm not going to try and fetch it right now. But it is like cardboard. It's super duper stiff. So that is a really good option for adding stability to things. You can also try like that nylon mesh canvas that people use for maybe like hook rugs or something. That's really good and stiff, and you can wash that. It's not going to disintegrate on you. So that's another option.
You can't really dry that though. Like wash it, but don't dry it. Like it's plastic, right?
Right. Don't put it in the dryer. It may melt. Good tip. But yeah, those two are good options for stabilizing the bottom of purses.
Is Peltex fusible or is it sew-in?
That's a good question. I have some. I haven't used it, so I'm not sure. I feel like it would be sew-in because it is so very thick. I don't know how it could be fusible, but maybe it could be. I don't know.
I mean, I know they make a heavyweight interfacing, and that was what I was going to ask you, because like with a heavyweight fusible interfacing, I feel like, you know, you're literally, your iron is on there so long trying to get stuff to fuse to it. But
right. Google is telling me that Peltex is one-sided fusible. So
perfect.
Can be fusible.
You just need a hot iron.
Yep, very hot. And it's worth mentioning that if something is fusible, it doesn't mean you have to fuse it. If you're more comfortable sewing it in, go right ahead and do that.
Absolutely. I'm all about the quickest way. I like fusible.
Me too.
All right, next question here. It's about back to some pattern alterations, but is a full bust adjustment only done on the front of the bodice?
Yes. Yes, so when I said whatever you do to the front, you do the back, that does not apply to that. I was making generalizations, which I should not do. But anything that you do to the front seam, to like a seam that is going to attach to the back seam, you know, you do that to the matching seams.
So like the
But
sides and the shoulders, that's pretty much.
yes.
Okay, there we go. But yeah, all right. Full bust adjustment only in the front. All right. Next question here. What is your favorite stabilizer?
I use most of the time just a medium weight fusible. I'm sure it's by Pellon because that's what Joann Fabrics carries, and that's just by default where I have to shop. But yeah, actually, I think it's probably called a featherweight because when they say medium weight, it gets thick pretty quickly. So it is actually more of a lightweight, like a feather to lightweight. So I don't usually require a lot of stabilizing or stiffness. It's usually just in collars or in a facing or something. So it all depends on what your intended end use is. But typically I just use a lighter weight.
I have to say my favorite is the medium weight fusible. And I have to admit that I'm going to have to buy interfacing for the first time in like a long time because some friends gave me like rolls of this. It's called Shirt Fuse. It's really old and they don't even make it anymore. It's like got vintage tags and stuff on it. And I'm finally out of it. And I'm like, I haven't bought interfacing in years. I don't even know where to start shopping for it. But I'm going to have to go buy some, I guess.
Yeah, dive into the world of buying interfacing.
Step outside my little comfort zone of just always having that roll there. All right, our next question here is, for stretchy knit fabric, would you use an elastic thread or how would you use regular thread to sew this fabric?
So when sewing stretchy knit fabric, you can use regular all-purpose thread. The main thing is whenever you're sewing a seam that needs stretch, so the neckline, if you're going to stretch it over your head, or the cuff if it needs to stretch over your wrist, the hem if it's going to be kind of tight to your body, you want to use a stretch stitch. So you can use ballpoint needle, all-purpose thread. Usually I just use a zigzag stitch. And that stitch will have give and allow that seam to stretch with the fabric as you're stretching to put it on or whatever you need to do. I mentioned the triple stitch. That's good for, it can be good for construction seams as well, but it's really good for if you want to do something decorative on a knit fabric as well, because it looks like a straight stitch, but it has that extra stitch in the middle that allows it to stretch and kind of pull apart and have some give. So when you're sewing the vertical seams that don't require stretch, you can use a straight stitch if you would like. You can also use a zigzag stitch. It's easy. There's no harm in doing it. It uses a little bit more thread, but it's not a huge deal. But the seams that go around the circumference of your body, if you're sewing something a knit garment that's like billowy and blousy like the trend is, and it doesn't require stretching over your head, you could use a straight stitch for that. But whenever a seam requires stretch, use a stretch stitch, zigzag stitch, or triple stitch. That's the hard and fast rule.
Perfect. Since we're talking about stretchy fabric, we have one more here. It says, how do you sew on stretchy fabric and not have it stretch out of shape, specifically when sewing a hem?
Good question. I also discussed that in my intermediate sewing video, but I'll give you the boiled down version. So when a knit fabric will stretch under the presser foot if the presser foot is mashing down on the fabric so hard that the feed dogs are like pulling it through under the needle, and it stretches out the fabric as you're stitching, and you get those gnarly waves that you do not want. A lot of times those can be pressed out or steamed out, but sometimes they cannot. So you can do a couple of things. You can lessen the presser foot pressure. Check your manual to see how to do that, or type it into your search bar. with your make and model for specific instructions on how to do that. Or if you can't, some machines you can't do that on, you can try a roller foot, a roller presser foot, or a walking foot. That helps feed the fabric along with the feed dogs, you know, pulling it through under the needle so it doesn't get stretched out. Or you can put tissue paper under the layers. It just stabilizes the fabric, and you can do, if one layer underneath isn't enough, you can do a layer on top as well. Just sandwich your fabric in between layers of tissue paper, and I find that helps it slide under the presser foot and also kind of stabilizes it. So that